right. Thank you for coming, everybody. My name is Dean Takahashi. I'm the lead writer for GamesBeat at VentureBeat. I've been writing about games for 10 years. Moderated the eSports session this morning, and happy to do this one again. eSports is maybe 1% of the $138 billion game business, and so now we're going to talk about the other 99%, I guess. And I've been writing about games for about 22 years. I also hold the GamesBeat conference as well. And I'm going to have my panelists introduce themselves, starting with Frank on this end.
Hi, my name is Frank Soqui. I'm Vice President, General Manager of Virtual Reality at Intel. Nice to meet you.
Peter Levin. I'm President of Interactive Ventures, Games, and Digital Strategy at Lionsgate.
I'm Emily Greer, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Kongregate, a games platform and publisher.
I'm Kathee Chimowitz, the CRO for BoomBit Games.
So, yeah, thank you, everybody. And so we all know games are big, but they do have some issues. We're going to get into some of that in this session, and especially as we think about how we're going to go from about 2 billion gamers on the planet to maybe 3 billion or more. We know, according to Newzoo, that the business is about $138 billion in 2018, and that's expected to grow to $180 billion by 2021. And now I have a trivia question for the audience here. What is the single most successful entertainment product of all time? Does anybody know the answer to that? Is it Star Wars? Is it Gone with the Wind? No. Anyway, it is Grand Theft Auto 5, which has sold 90 million units worldwide, and it's brought in $6 billion in revenue alone for a single title in a long-running franchise series. Right? Star Wars is at something like $4 billion. I think Peter can elaborate on this a little bit about the relations between, say, games and movies as far as how big things are. Maybe you want to do that.
Sure. I mean, I think the fact that we're having the conversation is fascinating, right? The fact that GTA was able to compile $6 billion of revenue. However, when you look at Star Wars, you have these other areas of revenue generation, licensing and merchandising, theme parks now, all these other extensions of the brand that have been very germane to that IP for decades. And I think as a company like Lionsgate, when we're able to adapt intellectual property into multiple formats, film, television, and games, they support one another. They can be accretive to one another. A great example for us last year with our Power Rangers film that came out. We had a very successful mobile game based on that IP that continues to live on. So should we continue to make Power Rangers films, we'll have a built-in audience that we don't have to recreate. But I think that, again, just coming back to the stats, the fact that there are titles that exist at that level in the game space, and there are multiple titles. It's not just GTA, and there are multiple titles that have lived on for years and decades in some instances. I think that's a part of the narrative that a lot of folks aren't familiar with and would not have guessed in a million years.
And I guess a much lesser known game is MapleStory from Nexon, and it's 8+ years running now, and it's generated $8 billion. And that revenue comes from a free-to-play game. We're getting into some of the distinction a little bit, but I think it's just good to know from the start that gaming is not going to be mainstream. It's not going mainstream. It's already mainstream, and it's already in many ways as big as any other kind of entertainment. For some time, it has had a stepchild feeling to it, or some kind of inferiority complex compared to some of the other older forms of entertainment. But there's a lot less reason for that now. and I think we'll get into whether it is overcoming some of that as well. But I throw something up in the air here for everybody to talk about. Maybe starting with Kathee at the end. How do we get to the next billion gamers?
I completely believe it's mobile. Mobile is 51% of that $138 billion this year, and we're growing. The mobile penetration is happening around the world. So you can look at Vietnam. I think it has double digits growth over years. I think it's like 12% for mobile penetration. So definitely in mobile. And then also Messenger. Facebook Messenger has games and also WeChat. So WeChat's one of the biggest messenger platform in China. So if imagine them playing games, then you know that we're going to get up to 1 billion pretty quickly.
And Emily, what are your thoughts on that?
I would say the same thing. I think particularly looking as Android explodes in mobile in developing markets, that Android itself is probably the single biggest going to be the single biggest gaming platform. I think that as technology continues to improve, in particular HTML5 is very lightweight way of making games that works on mobile web. It works really PC, mobile, etc. That makes it easier to make very small bite-sized games that are easily delivered even on poorer phones, poorer connections, and that will be very important as infrastructure continues to improve.
And it's like the foundation for a lot of messenger games.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, that's a foundation for it. Yeah.
Peter, how about you?
I answered earlier. I mean, I would say, my master's degree in the obvious, but with the metrics that we're talking about, mobile is a ginormous force. You have entire markets like the subcontinent where they are wide open, and there is very little uptake of the types of phones and devices that are going to allow for qualitative gaming experiences. That alone is north of 1 billion. So you're talking about prospective markets, untapped, that are going to have access to cheaper hardware, software, intellectual property. India, for example, it's an English-speaking market. So that there is a huge opportunity in and of itself. And then when you look at games like Arena of Valor, 300 million monthly active users, I think was the last number. I'm sure it's higher at this point. These are just breathtaking metrics.
Frank, you're Vice President and General Manager of Virtual Reality. You're at Intel. Kind of counting on you to say something other than mobile games here.
I will. Actually, not to discount mobile. It's clearly an awesome phenomenon, but I tend to think about it slightly differently when I think about the next billion players. I think about content, I think about architecture, and I think about audience. So when I talk about content, so many times we get to a space where something brand new is coming around the corner, and we're wondering if it's going to be the next big thing. Let's say it's VR, AR, you name your favorite technology. But what's more important than the type of technology or type of experience is the content. Is it telling a compelling story? And we need a lot more content out there and a segmented set of content. Sometimes we imagine that only the big players are going to win in the area of gaming, but just like you were talking a little bit about movies, I think it's a segmented market with indie players and things like that. But content's crazy important, and content that rides across a variety of compute platforms. Whether it's mobile, PC, notebook, you name it, right? Just anything that lets me play the game the way I want to play it on my favorite set of devices, then I'll do that. The other one is architecture. These are crazy immersive games, and they have tremendous workloads. The audience, I'll mention audience in a minute, but these workloads are tremendous. I mean, I want to stream, I want to capture my gameplay, I want a social experience, I want to interact in ways I could not interact before. I want controllers, I want sick stuff. I mean, you name it, anything that makes me feel like I'm becoming more and more part of what that experience is. That architecture, not only on the PC side or the phone side, but the architecture from cloud to edge to 5G that deliver that experience in a very responsive, low latency way is going to be crazy important. And then audience. We keep thinking about gaming, whether it's real sports or eSports, as it's about the player. It's not only about the player. The audience is a huge portion of why we are doing what we're doing. The audience being able to interact with the game, I think we're on the verge of that, where the audience becomes non-player characters, or the audience interacts with other audience members in a social kind of way. I think there's a tremendous focus on audience because that's who you're serving, and then there's a ton of businesses that end up spinning around what the audience wants to go do, and not the least of which is advertising, but how they connect with each other socially and how they get advice on what the latest gaming PC or mobile platform is that they want to go use. So I think when you hit on all those three, you're going to start reaching those next set of billion players.
So I sometimes measure what's trendy by what stories I'm writing in a given week, and I've written 15,000 stories at VentureBeat in the last 10 years.
Oh man!
A couple years ago, I was writing virtual reality stories every week, investments every week. Now they're not happening. Now it's eSports, right? eSports has taken over. In some ways, VR didn't live up to all the hypes associated with it in its first generation. And Frank, I wonder if you can address, what that means, for either the next generation or whether, VR is viewed by a lot of people as kind of a fizzle, I guess.
Yes, so at the beginning of any technology hype cycle, there's always this curve, right? Call it trough of disillusionment, or whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of experimentation that happens, a lot of high hopes about it. It goes through some practical sort of adoption phases and then makes its way through that. I think at Intel, we view things like augmented reality and virtual reality as these once in every 20-year phenomena. Before there was a graphical user interface, it was just text, if you can imagine that. People thought graphical user interface was, that's for kids, nobody wants a graphical user interface. All of a sudden, you can't live without it. You came up with touch, it seems a little gimmicky. I want to touch things, my screen. All of a sudden, you can't live without it. You can't touch a screen today, and if it doesn't respond to you, you think it's broken. I think the way we are going to interact with compute is going to be through things like these types of realities, these immersive type technologies. It's going to change the way we interact with each other and the way we interact with compute. And to get all worried early on that it's just not taking off the way we overhyped it is not the point. I think you look for clues about where it's getting used. It's getting used in gaming, entertainment, retail, surgical theater. These types of realities are traversing segments like they've never done before. So just to segue away from gaming, there's true ROIs that are getting measured on the on the commercial side. This is why we're still pretty bullish on the opportunity around VR. Ignore the hype. I understand that sometimes we like talking about things that we're going to take off tomorrow, but I believe this is a once in 20-year transformation on how we're going to interact with compute, so I'm still pretty bullish on it.
And Peter, you've been investing in VR, but you've also invested in a lot of other types of games. What's your own feeling about it now?
Very bullish on the medium, as I've said a bunch, very bearish on the timeline for commercial traction. I think though we have invested in some VR vehicles, we at every turn have brought in platform players and hardware players and endemics to mitigate our financial downside. So for a couple of reasons. One, very few people have the 10 feet by 10 feet within their home to enjoy a qualitative VR experiences. More and more people's homes are beginning to look like an airplane galley, like Bruce Willis's apartment in The Fifth Element, versus like having that disposable, 10 by 10 feet within their footprint. For us, location-based entertainment was a priority from day one. You had a lot of aligned interests there. You had big retail footprints that were looking for programming and content to house within that footprint as they were losing customers and audience to online retailing experiences. You have movie theater chains, and again, any other host of retail footprints. So that has been our priority. I think we chose not to pull the trigger on investing in any one particular VR production entity. It was a deliberate decision made early on. For us, it was about let's work with as many as we can, and if we find that we're interoperating well with one entity or another, then we can contemplate a more strategic relationship. I think part of our issue fundamentally was these weren't necessarily content-driven organizations, and so for us, it is all about storytelling. Yeah. We are a content-driven company, content first. So I think as water seeps to its own level within the VR space, again, bullish on what the future has to bring, both with VR and AR. But we're just trying to, be smart about how we deploy against it.
Anybody else want to weigh in or not?
Sure. I don't invest in VR. I don't make VR games, so I'm a typical consumer of VR, and I see it not as an experience at home, because again, there's, like Peter said, that you have to have a big 10 by 10 blog. But I went to something called The Void, where you can actually wear a pack and have a VR experience with a friend, just like you would go to a movie and have fun being like a rebel soldier, fighting other stormtroopers. I think that's kind of where VR is going.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting about how some of the VR companies have pivoted into different spaces and getting their games into VR arcades, where they can charge $5 or $10 or $15 per customer as a way to get VR out into the public and into the hands of people who are not going to pay $1,000 for a PC first and then go buy something else to go with it, like a VR headset for hundreds of dollars more.
Yeah.
It's an interesting pivot for VR companies.
For me, the way I see it is for I think VR is magical, but for it to go mainstream, we need to figure out how to make it work with sort of our instinctive bodily reactions to immersion. The trend in media over the last few decades has been away from immersion and towards convenience, away from sort of IMAX movie theater towards phone consumption, and that's something that VR needs to take into account. A lot of us feel a little uncomfortable when we're disconnected from the world, so things like what Kathee's talking about, where you go someplace and have this magical experience, and it's a little out of world, I think works better than an in-home experience the way that the initial versions of VR have presented.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was interesting this week. Facebook finally launched the Oculus Go for $199. It's a standalone VR. You don't have to plug it into a PC. It has no wires. You can take it with you wherever you want to go, and you can enjoy VR. Maybe that's not the way Frank wants VR to happen, but it helps, right?
You know what? I'm a fan of VR is going to happen the way it's going to happen, right? And I'm a strong believer in a segmented market. There's going to be all-in-ones, there's going to be phones, there's going to be PCs, there's going to be notebooks. There's going to be even more experimentation around the headsets. So I'm not too really worried about, what it may or may not do to the PC ecosystem. What I tend to think about is what I brought up a little bit earlier, which is these tremendous immersive interactive workloads just put a lot of pressure on the data center, or the compute performance, the graphics, the network, the edge, 5G, and of course, Intel makes lots of devices at the edge too, and we're continuing to evolve those. I just see a bright future for, what's going on in compute and the demands going on there. Every time we produce something more on the compute side, where compute or graphics or storage, something comes along like VR to just challenge the heck out of that, and it creates more demand for what we're delivering there. Perfectly comfortable that all-in-ones also do well.
Yeah. And speaking of something totally different or a different direction, I'd like to play our video now. And Kathee will talk a bit about this and why she wanted to show this video and sort of bring up this subject here as well. So, you guys have that video? Yeah, thanks.
Jada's always wanted to play computer games, but never been able to. Jada's cerebral palsy and finds fine motor skills very difficult, so the hand controls are extremely difficult.
As I got older, my muscles get weaker to the point where I can no longer use a controller. I found them by searching through Google. I watched some of the videos from what they've done before. And I thought, yeah, they can possibly get me gaming.
Games are important to me because after having more than 10 years without them, thanks to the guy that's special effect, then put them back onto it again. Now I've got something to look forward to every day.
Games are important to me because, like other kids, I can't go out and play football, so I do it on a computer screen, which probably sounds completely nerdy, but it's good because you get the same amount of fun that they do.
For me, playing video games is about escapism, about being away from reality and work and the problems of life, and being able to do something that I enjoy and find very relaxing. If it wasn't for playing video games, I would find it very difficult to do other things due to my disability and my physical limitation.
Special effects help me to have lots of fun with my computer. I can't do a lot by myself, but I can play video games on my own, which gives me a good sense of independence and achievement.
Kath, you want to talk about why you wanted to show that?
Yeah, turning powerful ideas into actionable action. So thank you, Milken. You know, I believe that we can help the disabled. Special Effect is a company that makes controllers for the disabled modified for their needs, even like chin controllers, which you may have seen. They have an eye controller, and they've made a software free for anyone in the world to play Minecraft called iMine. And I'm hoping that one day that when you're in a hospital one day, and God forbid if you ever are, but you may, or in a hospice, that in the meantime of waiting for your family, you can play games and you can have a relaxing experience. You can engage with something, and then hopefully with your family as well. So it's kind of a multiplier. And also, I just believe in like the good that we could do for the community. Again, in the last slide, or the second to last slide, 80 of us got together in the mobile developer community, and we donated all of our UK revenue to them last year on September 29th.
So Kathee and I got into a discussion about this offline, and you know, I am now sort of playing a little devil's advocate here, but I felt like, you know, we're talking about getting games into the hands of the next billion gamers. Why do you want to bring this up? Which is something that is a very valid and very you know, noble cause, but only helps a small number of people. Like if you do a special controller, you may be making games more accessible to, you know, 100 people across the world or something like that.
Oh, it's definitely way more. They've actually had 400 patients in-house, and with iMine, it's like a global expansion. But it's not just those players that have now the chance to play games that never could before. It's their family that now can see them happy and want to play games with them. So it's kind of a multiplier there. I also met the founder of Nevermind, and she had created a game to help with anxiety and PTSD by doing biofeedback and measuring your heart rate through your Apple Watch, seeing facial recognition in your webcam, and seeing if you get more anxiety and are more anxious. And the way to calm you down was to give you more pressure and try to train you to calm down. So I believe that all this technology we can play with and later at one point make something fantastic. Like let's say we get biofeedback with our Pandora list, and all of a sudden, you know, Pandora knows that you want or you need to chill out, so I'm going to play you some chill music. Or you know, have that initial feedback just from your body, maybe into apparel, like where there's a biofeedback of understanding like your emotion, whether you should be like more inflamed or not, your clothes will change color. And then maybe your watch not only tells you to breathe, but tells you to drink some water. You know, it's time to replenish. So
I went up to Redmond and I visited Microsoft's inclusivity lab up there, and they're working on the, you know, research on different kinds of controllers and ways to control games. And you know, one of the interesting aha moments of this is that you know, if you work on technology to improve games for a few people, you may find things that actually benefit everybody, right? Who's to say that a 16-button controller that has been that way for decades is the best way to interface with a game, right? You know, it actually creates a lot of obstacles for people who are intimidated by that. Now, Nintendo found this when they, you know, or sort of upended this when they created the Wii, right? Then they came up with a controller that was more like a remote control, and it recognized gestures. And so the research that goes into finding alternative ways to make games accessible actually comes back in a big way in some ways to help this sort of billions of people. You could think of the space race too as a similar analogy where NASA created the best way to get to the moon. But we got all these other benefits from the technology that came from it, including semiconductors, right? Chips, and even Velcro or Tang, right? All these unintended things come out of doing the research on technology that in some ways may be helping just a few people. Anyway, that's my speech.
I would say, I still think forensically we really haven't discovered the value in terms of expansion of the global games audience of Twitch. Right? So even though it was bought for $1 billion, just shy of by Amazon, when you look at the markets that it was able to couple together, right? So much of that traffic was coming from Eastern Europe and China and Brazil and really markets where there wasn't console penetration. So you were dealing with these massive audiences that now had the ability to participate in the global games community in a way that they really hadn't before, to a much lesser degree. Companies like GameSpy did it very early on with its crawler out on the web as middleware. But this was the first global scaled, think of it, ESPN for eSports, if you will, platform. And I think at the end of the day, most folks would recognize that it was a steal at $1 billion. But what it was able to do in terms of the turbocharging and the direct connection between these consuming constituencies, we hadn't seen that before.
And so we can think of other things that have held gaming back in some ways. There's the sort of mass culture on the one hand, and there's the subculture on the other. And I want to talk about this a little. Toxicity in the subculture of hardcore games is something that has scared everybody, right? If you look at Gamergate, if you look at what the internet has been used for to bully people who are not good at games, myself included, right? This gets a little scary. It intimidates people. It stops them from picking up a controller to try out a game because in some ways gaming is perceived as not welcoming, right? I wonder if you guys want to talk about this. Emily, maybe.
Yeah, I think one way to think about that is not, though, as a toxicity problem in games, but a toxicity problem in our online culture generally. And games, because so much of what happens is online and is so much about group play and group interaction, which is amazing, also attracts that same general online toxicity. What I think is interesting and special about games is that I think we have a unique opportunity to try and address and try and reshape the culture of toxicity. A large group of publishers in the last year announced a group called the Fair Play Alliance, which includes a lot of people like Riot and Epic and smaller companies like Kongregate, where we are sharing data and sharing best practices with each other as we experiment with incentives and forms of communication and feedback mechanisms in games that encourage positive teamwork as opposed to negative griefing. And I think that type of thing and that type of effort can create a lot of learnings in the game industry that maybe then can go on to be useful to people like Facebook and Twitter and the general culture. I also think as games we have a little more freedom to experiment because everybody is there to play games, and there's less questions of sort of freedom of speech or what right do you have to tell me what to think or do. We're here to play games. We're here for everybody to play games, and so we have a little more freedom to experiment and change how things are done.
Anybody else want to riff as well?
I'm a fan of the Fair Play Association as well. Intel's part of it, but I want to amplify what you said a little bit, which is You know, whether we like it or not, this toxic environment exists. You say online, it exists socially, where people are side by side or in audiences. Whether you want to talk about politics, it's just very toxic. And it doesn't have to be. The thing that gives me hope about some of the online things going on, including things like gaming and other social media, is although the ability to be toxic seems to become easier, the community that comes out in response to that is also easier for them. You know, I don't want to say they can fix the world's problems, but people need to lean in. When you stand for something and you're a gamer and you want to include everybody, including people who have other, you know, physical disabled things that keep them from being there, and you want to be inclusive and you speak out against what's happening in the gaming environment, those people are not going to enjoy being there, right? I think there are tools and things we can put in place through that Fair Trade Association. Some of the research might reveal some things, but ultimately, Toxicity comes down to what do you as a community believe and want to be known for, right? We have to be able to speak out as gamers and people that support gaming and say, this is baloney, right? We're here to have fun and connect with each other. We're not here to, you can't get rid of trolls, sorry, but you can blunt them a little bit, right? You cannot make them so important. You not give them the power they don't deserve.
Yeah. I heard on another panel an interesting thought as well, which was, you know, toxicity is associated with anonymity. But more and more gamers, you know, and the communications that are systems that are supporting gaming are heading towards live, you know, communication. So like live streaming, right? If you're a live streamer and you're a toxic person, and you use that language in your live stream, you get called out now and asked to apologize for it by lots and lots of people. You know. They can now, you know, just, it sort of removes that anonymity of how you behave, right? If everybody's live streaming, nobody can be anonymous anymore, right, in some ways. Anyway, you know, I think, you know, hopefully we're not scaring off all the investors here. They've kind of been scared of games in a way already, you know. We've always heard this phrase about investors fearing games because it's a hits-driven business, right? And they've shied away from picking the hits the same way they would shy away from, you know, picking which Hollywood movie is going to be a great hit. But you know, in some ways, I heard another investor, John Goldman, who invests only in games at Greycroft. You know, he said that you know, that applies to everything, right? If you just analyze any business, there's only going to be one Amazon, right? There's only going to be one Google. You are taking risks by investing. You know, gaming is sort of not doubly handicapped in this way. You just sort of have to pay attention and deal with the fact that you know, you may be risking something, right? I don't know if you guys have some other thoughts about this stereotype.
Yeah, I think one thing is that yes, it's hits driven, but those hits are really, really long lasting, and a successful game will last not just for a year or for months, but for decades. And you know, we see that with World of Warcraft, Pokemon Go, Candy Crush, you know, almost any major game that you can name has lasted and been tremendously profitable for years. So yes, you are investing towards that one special game, but once you have hit, you have created a cultural phenomenon and a profitable cultural phenomenon that will last, that has really, really long-lasting value.
I would say, you know, the part of the issue is you've got a culture and a DNA of a lot of the investment communities that do not have a track record or the experience or the pedigree of investing in anything content related. So the notion that a games investment would somehow differ from investing in a production company or a digital studio or a VR production entity, I think some of it is the shiny toy phenomenon. Oh, let's invest in that thing that seems to have a lot of attention being paid to it. And then it becomes part of their portfolio, and it's neither fish nor fowl. And inevitably, as companies do, you know, perhaps they miss their numbers a bit, or a milestone or the market slows down a little bit, and then a lot of questions get asked around it. I think, the good thing is, as the games business has diversified and matured, you now have a portfolio of discrete investors who do bring that pedigree and that acumen and that network and that operational experience, to the table. I mean, we have a bunch of those partners in the deals that we do, VCs like Ridge Ventures, Phil Sanderson there, and Gregory Milken, who's our partner in at least 2 of our deals. Mitch Lasky, the list goes on, Index. So you're starting to get these VCs that have, multiple persons within their portfolio of investors who do bring in that perspective and that experience and pedigree. And I think they better understand, to the point that was made, and it's the worst acronym ever, but Games as a Service, GAS. We really do have to find a better acronym for it. But it rings true, because when you look at the number of titles that have now existed for 5, 7, 9, 25 years, in the instance of a Warcraft, or even more so, MapleStory is a great example, as well. So far beneath the radar screen, but what an unbelievable story. And so, I think that speaks volumes.
I think there are other investment strategies as well, like, there's sort of the picks and shovels strategy, or there's the going up a level and abstracting to a platform level. And somebody who's shy about investing in a game might be more inclined to invest in the game platform. And I think a lot of startups in the game industry have recognized this, and they've pitched themselves as platforms or tool makers instead of the vendors of individual games, right? And
you're also seeing interesting innovation in things like Kickstarter and Fig, where essentially the funding for games and the investment for games is coming from gamers themselves, which shows, maybe there's opportunities for sort of co-investing with people who are already passionate about games. Once a game has shown traction, then the investment dollars.
That
right.
comes down to
Kickstarter
why
validates the sort of the goodness of a game.
Is the audience interested?
But that comes down to why you're an investor. Not all investors are built the same. Some are looking for disruptive technology to invest in because they'll bet on 10 because one will win. Some investors are looking for steady, flat growth or moderate growth because they want to take risk out of portfolio. Some of them have a diversity of the portfolio. They invest in the infrastructure, they invest in the distribution mechanisms, they invest in the game itself as a portfolio. So when you say investors are shy and it's based on big hits, I gotta tell you, if that's the type of investor you are, probably investing in the wrong thing if you're only focused on big hits. Sounds like you're looking for that one win to make your portfolio. Nothing else is going with you, nothing else is like that. If you think about real sports, that's not the way you invest. You invest in advertising, distribution, leagues, merch, you name it. Well, what do you invest in? What kind of portfolio investor are you, right? What are you looking for?
I do think eSports has taken a page somewhat from what not to do. Right, so I think there's a lot of dumb money being thrown at a bunch of team ownership and being part of a foundational block within the standing up of some of these leagues. And when you look at, for example, the quality of ownership that's been put together around the Overwatch League, it's a breath of fresh air, right? They went through an arduous process of filtering and editing and making sure they were making decisions based upon strategic value, operational expertise, market acumen, all of these things. And you now had folks sitting around this table where there's plenty of gaming DNA, but global sports infrastructure, operational DNA, licensing and merchandise DNA in areas that games companies never played in before. Apparel, shoe deals. I'm plugging our K-Swiss deal here. And all of these areas where, nobody thought the worlds would collide are colliding. So you want them to collide with the folks who have, the acumen to act against that. And I think, some of the other publishers, for example, who just plucked folks from game ops and that side of the house and said, hey, you're now going to go run our league. You wouldn't do that in any other business. I'm not going to go out and run a waste management company. It would, there's a learning curve. Maybe I could figure that out over time, but it would be a liability. And I do think, esports, yes, we talked about it as, is it a shiny new toy? Is it, the last couple of years, VR, I think it's wildly different. And I think the contemplative nature with which a lot of these folks are vetting their ownership speaks to it.
Now we sort of touched on this notion that investors might be more interested in investing in something like games and something else, right? Or something on the edge of the gaming industry. And I brought up, blockchain and cryptocurrency in games. And nobody on the panel wanted to talk about that.
No.
We can. I think it'll be brief.
Yeah, it's like a whole other subject unto itself. But I'm one of those gamers who would like to see the metaverse happen, right? The world of Ready Player One. And that is a collection of worlds, right? It's not just one world, it's a collection of worlds, virtual worlds or whatever you're gonna call them. And the way you would connect those worlds is through a cross-platform technology. And the transparency of blockchain, to me, seems like a necessary tool for this to happen. And so Tim Sweeney, the CEO of Epic Games, he's smarter than me. He thinks that blockchain is one of these building blocks to the metaverse. And he thinks that the metaverse will be buildable within a very short period of time. I don't know if anybody wants to talk about the metaverse, maybe?
I would say probably blockchain is a contributing factor, but let me hypothesize something else, which is if you want individuals to be part of this metaverse and you want them to be able to create their own version of their metaverse as an add-on, and you want to democratize things, blockchain may or may not help, but I would say I think distributed compute, being able to control my environment and hook it into bigger environments and the social, I think that whole backbone infrastructure is what's going to enable that to happen. I think transactions and IP can be secured with blockchain, but I think fundamentally you need a software and a hardware architecture to go get something like that to happen.
Well, we had one panelist who wants to talk about blockchain, so thank you, Frank.
Mr. Intel.
Blockchain is a decentralizing force, and that is an interesting subject within games as well. And I think, I'm kind of curious what you guys think about the forces that are democratizing and decentralizing the game industry versus the forces that are monopolizing and centralizing the game industry.
Ooh, boy, that's a good one. I think democratization is an extension of a shared economy. It's my fundamental belief. When I make it easy for anybody to do something with an asset that they have or they want to control, I think you get disruptive type advancements. You get people doing what they want to go do. There are companies emerging today that are starting to democratize what's going on there. I think it's an intersection between some of the big players and some of the small players that are trying to democratize the development of games and the social interaction of games. Whether one wins or not, I mean, there's just the business economics here, right? Once something becomes apparent in a democratized kind of way, let's say Sansar's democratizing VR, the creation of VR content environments. Somebody's going to want to invest in them. They're going to have a set of VCs or companies that want to get a hold of that. I mean, I think there are things like that happening. I don't think it's a winner takes all. I'm glad there's democratization because I think that expands the total available market so that individuals can participate in that economy, not just buy into that economy, not just buy services, just the way I monetize my car, my room, or anything else.
Yeah. So, I mean, from my perspective, the big democratization that has happened in the game industry in the last 15 years has been the creation of tools that make professional tools like Unity, like backends as a service, AWS, et cetera, that make it possible for very small teams anywhere in the world to look on online videos, teach themselves how to make games, and actually make games. As a games publisher, we work with a lot of very small teams that make games. Sometimes as small as 1 or 2 people who are making games that we then take to mobile app stores and can get 10 million, 50 million installs on these games. Adventure Capitalist is a game that's an example where it was made by one person in 30 days as an experiment to learn Unity, and then now it's big multi-year success. And that's a tremendous democratization force. It doesn't matter that, EA has some amazing engine that they're working on, or Epic, et cetera, and it's allowed for games to really be made by anybody, anywhere in the world. What the enormous counter to that is, with so many games coming out, it is difficult to get attention. It is difficult to get on. It was difficult before to get on store shelves and get distribution in GameStop. Now it's difficult to get the attention on the app stores, on Steam, etc. And what we're finding is that the anti-democratization force is that to really reach scale, to reach a lot of people, you need advertising, and you need very big advertising budgets. So very small teams can make games, but very large budgets are needed to really get those games in front of people, and that has been, a sort of a tremendous counterforce on the industry. Now there are things like, YouTubers and Twitch streamers, et cetera, who discover some amazing indie game and start talking about it, and that's another sort of democratization of advertising, but it is it's something that is often out of your control. You get attention or you don't, and that's having everything be out of your control is frustrating for a lot of game developers.
It feels like partly what you're talking about is how do you get to scale, but I don't think the goal of democratization is always scale. The person you told me about Roblox, right? The person who, I think he was a teenager who did the game, he was doing it for him and his friends. It just happened to take off. Sometimes the goal behind democratization is because I'm trying to satisfy a need that's unmet right now, not because I'm trying to get to scale. I think bigger companies will look at those and figure out what's going to work for them for scale. So I think it's a continuum, a segmentation model versus it's one person takes all.
Well, as a capitalist, I would say, we're trying to get to a place of viability, right? So it's great. There's one-off stories of, this 1 or 2 person team, and they did it out of curiosity, and it took off. But at the end of the day, there's a bunch of different third-party publishing models that are developing and evolving. I also think, again, you're dealing with massive markets that have been untapped, that monetize differently than other markets. Focus on India yet again. Their in-game monetization behavior does not mirror that of the West or of China. So that is going to evolve into its own thing. Game mechanics, right? You've got games that have so risen above the noise, like a Fortnite, that are pale in comparison to the marketing budgets of some of the biggest publishers in the world.
And the interesting thing there was Battle Royale did not arise from the budgets for Call of Duty or for Battlefield. Kind of came out of the blue from one guy who spun out of Arma. Right?
And you look at that and you say, maybe it is because of the nimble nature of that company, right? Because they have a platform play as well, similar to a Unity, where that innovation drives. You've all these mutually aligned interests, and I think that is helping to create these, again, new relationships between bigger players and smaller players where their interests are financially aligned.
Yeah, it seems like, it's more of a tug of war as opposed to one side, like the centralizing or the decentralizing side is winning at any given point. And in this tug of war, there's a lot of opportunities, right? Like I would point out, say, with mobile, or before mobile, the game industry was Europe, Japan, and the U.S. And like a lot of the west coast of the U.S., right? With mobile, it's half the business worldwide now, and those companies can be started anywhere, and they have arisen everywhere, right? I've written about some game studios like in Siberia, or there's Supercell in Helsinki. These have sort of democratized the jobs in the game industry in a huge way. Like, they are now spread across many nations. Those jobs can be created in just about any country now. Eventually, a centralizing force comes along, and sometimes it ties them all together. In particular, I'm thinking of the largest gaming company in the world in that respect, and wondered if everybody knows who that is right now? The largest. Yep, Tencent, right? And so Tencent owns a piece of Activision. It owns a piece of Epic Games, it owns a piece, it owns Riot, it owns Supercell, it has a huge business in China, but it's always been investing sort of in a sort of more like a minority status, and has not been really taking over and consolidating all of these businesses as well. And so it's sort of this interesting tug of war within itself over centralization and decentralization, I think. You know, I think the outlook for games is you know, very positive in a lot of ways. There's so many forces pushing and pulling it in different directions. The outcome is only going to be good. Anyway, do you guys have any closing comments along those lines as well?
I know sometimes we ask questions like, how big is the gaming market, right? And you know, how many people are playing games and the demographics. I mean, everyone's a gamer. You forget, either you started playing cards or board games, or it goes from there just to more and more that's enabled with online kind of capabilities, digital media, content creation, everything that we talked about today. But it's like, am I a gamer? Yes, you are. Everybody already is a gamer. It's how we interact with each other, how we socialize, how we compete in fun ways. It's just been taken to another level.
Yeah.
Just remember that. Gaming is not a new phenomenon, but it is exploding across many, many different boundaries. I think the reach is, and the way it pulls people together is something that hasn't happened in a long time.
Yeah, there's a new platform called Kahoot, which allows anyone to make a game. You can make a quiz game. So educators are using that to teach kids math, science, language, whatever. You could use it as a manager for onboarding new hires in an easy way and test them, like if they actually learn, and time them on that. So gaming is like in education, in workspace, at home, relaxing. It's everywhere.
And I think the thing to keep in mind is how many hours per day people spend playing games. In terms of, if you look at the engagement with games, so many of the biggest games have not just hundreds of thousands, but millions, or tens of millions of daily players who are playing hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. It's really shaping the world that we live in a very meaningful way.
And it's also pulling in, when you look at, again, if you just look at the tweens, and there's been so much spoken about, how do you parent through Fortnite? Like, you can't turn on anything these days or open a publication and, not have someone try to educate you about how do you literally parent through Fortnite. Well, but there's also a lot of upside and positivity that's been discussed around it from those who study the sociological dynamics. And it's, a lot of kids are pulling from multiple constituents in their lives that they never would have put in a room together. And so they are cooperating in a way that they never have before. So I think, yes, it is rife with, all of the things that transpire within any online environment with social dynamics in and around it. And you throw in anonymity, and then you really get the cowards to rear their heads. But that being said, I think folks are working towards a lot of transparency. The great thing is, to your point, Emily, about the metrics of consumption cannot be ignored. The price points of the game's products cannot be ignored. The sheer scale of the industry versus other forms of media, cannot be ignored, and everything is tracking in the right direction.
I think we have time for one question, maybe. Sorry. Right over there. Amen.
I'm Ambassador Kumson, former ambassador of Ghana to U.S. I do have a small telecom license in Ghana, and I've discovered that the young people, including the older generation, people of my age, over 60, are now beginning to explore the gaming industry. I've traveled across several countries in Africa over the last year. I do that almost every year, and I'm trying to find out how do we bring this growing business onto the continent where it gives young people avenue for entertainment rather than to go into other types of skills that will become very injurious to them.
Well, I can tell you from, I think the two markets, the MENA, right, Middle East, North Africa, and Africa, there hasn't been a strategic conversation we've had in the game space where that is not a focus. I do think, again, it speaks to one of these untapped markets. And it feels as if there's a tremendous amount of appetite. I mean, I know Saudi, for example, punches way above their weight for Overwatch consumption. Like, it's a crazy number.
There is a new venture capital firm called Altered Ventures, whose mission is to invest in emerging markets in game projects. So that's one sort of encouraging sign. I think the other is that to have good game developers and a good game industry in your country, you need gamers, right? And so that's the place where you start, is to create a nation of gamers, and good things follow. One more question, actually. Right there. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Kit Boyd. I'm an independent video games consultant. So last year, Metacritic released a list of top game publishers. The 5 most successful game publishers last year, none of them had any new IP. Can you guys talk about existing IP? I know Lionsgate has a great stable of existing IP, using that to cut through the market versus independent darlings who are releasing new IP, and the relationship between the two.
In 30 seconds.
I'd say half of me wants to say that's great that they don't need the new IP, because these games, it's no longer about shrink wrap and shelf life and, oh my God, this thing has 6 weeks on the shelf and then we throw it into the discount bin. That model has completely changed. All that friction just no longer exists. So I think that's a really positive thing.
Yeah.
The flip side of it is there's new IP introduced all the time. You didn't know what Fortnite was 3 months ago, right? You know, most folks didn't. So I would say you can read data that probably demonstrates either way in your little echo chambers that we all have. But I think stepping back, there's a solve.
I think of IP slightly differently. It sounds like you're using IP in the context of an application. My IP is my game. But there's different types of IP. There's IP within that IP that it invites audience participation or viewership. There's IP that exists at a silicon layer. So yeah, there may not be brand new games on the horizon, but don't discount the indie developers out there. They're helping expand that TAM, and the guys that don't have new IP are watching them. Right?
He's selling chips.
Other thing is that it takes a while for something to grow into a top 5 IP. That's something that happens. Sometimes that happens in a month, but often it happens over a year. It's a slower build, and today's new IP is next year's top 5, or 2 years from now top 5, and that speaks to that depth of engagement, the length of time that people play games, and how that can build slowly over time.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to our panel.